Zarelle Nyx didn't walk down an aisle to meet her groom. She marched across the freezing, polished concrete of a private jet hangar. She wore her white silk wedding gown not like a dress, but like a suit of armor. Because if she was going to be sold to a crime syndicate to save her sister's life, she wasn't going to look like a victim. She was going to look like the most expensive problem they ever bought. Waiting for her in the shadow of a luxury jet was Aurelian Cross, the silent king. He sat in a matte black wheelchair, his face dangerously calm, looking at her with the cold calculation of a man assessing a volatile asset. The world thought he was a broken invalid. But when Zarelle locked eyes with him, she didn't see a helpless man. She saw a grenade with the pin pulled out. 1 year. That was the deal. 1 year to play the devoted wife, clean up his public image, and wipe out a debt that was drowning her family. One house filled with hidden cameras, one traitor watching their every move, and a husband who might be more dangerous than the enemies hunting him. What happens when the woman who fixes disasters for a living realizes she's trapped in one she can't control? And what happens when the fake marriage turns into a real war? Buckle up. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a hostage negotiation with a heartbeat. If you love dark romance, unexpected twists, and power couples who burn the world down, please subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a chapter. Your support helps us tell these stories. Now, let's rewind to where the nightmare began. 3 days ago, the only thing Zarelle Nyx was worried about was the relentless Chicago rain. She stood in the hallway of a crumbling apartment complex, staring at her sister's front door. It wasn't just unlocked, it was kicked in. The smell of stale fear and cheap cologne drifted out. Zarelle stepped over the shattered frame, her crisis manager brain already cataloging the damage: broken lamp, overturned table, and Maya, sobbing on the floor with a bruise blooming on her cheek. "Tell me you didn't," Zarelle whispered, her voice tight. "Tell me you didn't borrow from the syndicate." Maya looked up, eyes wide with terror. "I thought I could win it back, they said. They said they'd take my kidneys if I don't pay by Friday." Zarelle felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't just debt. It was a death sentence. And she had exactly 48 hours to find a miracle or a monster to make it go away. Zarelle didn't bring a gun to the back room of the midnight lounge. She brought a briefcase and a bluff that was rapidly falling apart. The air smelled of stale cigar smoke and impending violence. Across the scarred metal table sat Markov, a man whose neck was wider than her future, picking his teeth with a switchblade. 200,000, Zarelle said, forcing her voice to remain steady, the cool professional masking the terrified sister. "That's the principle. You waive the predatory interest, and I get you the cash in 24 hours. Markov laughed, a wet, ugly sound that made the 2 mountains of muscle by the door smirk. "Miss Nyx, you seem confused. Your sister didn't borrow from a bank. She borrowed from the syndicate. The debt is $3 million. We don't negotiate. We collect." He slammed the knife into the table. "We take the kidneys tonight." Zarelle's heart hammered against her ribs. She was calculating the distance to the door, hopeless, when the heavy steel entrance creaked open. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the temperature dropping 10 degrees. A man in a bespoke charcoal suit stepped into the grime, looking entirely out of place. He didn't look like a thug, he looked like a boardroom executioner. He held up a hand, and surprisingly, the guards stepped back. Even Markov looked nervous. "Mr. Lee," Markov grunted, shifting in his seat. "This is private business." "It's finished business," the newcomer said. His accent was crisp, elite, and bored. He ignored Markov completely and placed a sleek tablet on the table in front of Zarelle. "My employer has purchased your sister's debt, Miss Nyx, every cent. The syndicate has been paid." Zarelle stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Who is your employer?" "Aurelian Cross." The name sucked the air out of the room. The reclusive Korean tycoon, the invalid, the rumor. "What does a trillionaire want with me?" Zarelle asked, her throat dry. "You fix disasters," Mr. Lee said, tapping the screen to reveal a digital contract. "Mr. Cross has a crisis. He needs a wife, someone unconnected to his world, someone smart enough to navigate a shark tank and desperate enough to sign an NDA that practically carries a death penalty." "A wife," Zarelle scoffed, though her hands were shaking. You mean a prop. I mean a shield, Lee corrected softly. 1 year, you live in his house, you fix his public image, you fend off the vultures circling his wheelchair. In return, the debt is erased. Maya lives. He slid a heavy black fountain pen across the metal. Refuse, and I walk out that door. Markov stays. Zarelle looked at Markov, who was grinning like a wolf waiting for the fence to break. She thought of Maya's terrified face. She thought of the independence she had spent 10 years fighting for, about to be sold for a signature. She picked up the pen. It felt cold, heavy. 1 year, she whispered. To the second, Lee promised. Zarelle signed her name in black ink. The moment the tip left the screen, she knew she hadn't just signed a marriage license. She had signed a confession. She was the property of the Cross Empire now, and she had a feeling the monsters in Aurelian's house were going to make Markov look like a puppy. The Cross estate wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum of glass and black steel carved into the mountainside of Gangnam. As the armored SUV wound up the private road, Zarelle watched the city of Seoul glittering below like a sea of diamonds she could no longer touch. The gates at the top were 12 feet high, topped with cameras that tracked the car's movement with the precision of a predator watching prey. When the car stopped in the circular driveway, the silence was deafening. There were no birds, no wind, just the hum of the engine and the oppressive weight of the stone walls. Mr. Lee opened her door. Welcome home, Mrs. Cross. Zarelle stepped out, clutching her purse. The air was colder up here. Before she could take a step toward the massive double doors, Lee held out a gloved hand. Your phone, please, and your passport. Zarelle stiffened, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. Excuse me. Protocol, Lee said, his voice devoid of apology. To protect Mr. Cross's privacy, no unmonitored devices are allowed on the premises, and as for the passport, we will keep it safe for you. You won't be needing it. You have nowhere else to go. The threat was wrapped in silk, but it was still a threat. Zarelle looked at the perimeter wall, the armed guards patrolling the garden, and the sheer isolation of the peak. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her last lifeline to Maya, to Chicago, to herself, and dropped it into his palm. Then came the passport. With it went her freedom. The front doors opened, revealing a foyer that looked more like a museum than a living space. The floors were marble so polished they looked like water. In the center of the hall stood a man who made the guards outside look like amateurs. He was broad, with a buzz cut and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He wore a suit that strained at the shoulders, and his eyes were cold, dead things. This is Chief of Security Han, Lee introduced. He manages the estate and Mr. Cross's well-being. Han didn't bow. He didn't smile. He looked Zarelle up and down, assessing her not as the lady of the house, but as a potential security breach. The East Wing is off-limits, Han said, his voice a deep gravel. The servers are off-limits. You will not speak to the staff unless necessary. You will not leave the grounds without my authorization. I thought I was here to be his wife, Zarelle said, channeling every ounce of crisis management bravado she had left. Not his inmate. Where is my husband? Mr. Cross is fragile, Han said, a flicker of something mocking dancing in his eyes. He is resting. He is not to be disturbed by outside stressors. I determine what is a stressor. Zarelle felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Han wasn't protecting Aurelian from the world. He was protecting the world from Aurelian. He wasn't a bodyguard. He was a warden. I see, Zarelle said softly, stepping past him toward the staircase. She didn't see, but as the heavy locks of the front door slammed shut behind her, echoing like a gunshot, she realized the truth. She hadn't just married a trillionaire. She had voluntarily walked into a prison cell worth billions. The master suite was a cavern of obsidian and glass, cold enough to preserve a corpse. In the center of the room lay Aurelian Cross, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a ghost trapped in his own skin. Zarelle approached the bedside table, her crisis manager brain already analyzing the discrepancies. Beside a half-empty glass of water sat a pill organizer. She picked up one of the capsules, rolling it between her fingers. Before her career in crisis management, Zarelle had spent 2 years in a pre-med pharmacy program, a life she'd traded for the faster pace of corporate warfare. She recognized the stamp. It wasn't a nerve regenerator for a spinal injury. It was a heavy-duty sedative, a dose high enough to keep a grown man in a permanent, waking dream. "You aren't healing," she whispered, looking at Aurelian's slack jaw. "They're keeping you under." She knew the risks. If Han caught her, she'd be buried in the Korean hillside. But Zarelle didn't do anything passive. She reached into her vanity kit, pulling out a bottle of high-potency B-complex vitamins she'd brought from Chicago. They were the same size, the same color. With steady hands, she swapped the sedatives for the vitamins, then waited. 6 hours later, the room was bathed in the bruised purple light of dawn. Zarelle was startled from a light sleep by the sound of a glass shattering. She bolted upright. Aurelian wasn't in the bed. The shadows by the window shifted. Before she could scream, a hand like a vice clamped over her mouth, and she was slammed backward. Her spine hit the cold marble wall with a thud that knocked the air from her lungs. Aurelian Cross was towering over her. He wasn't sitting. He was braced against the wall with one trembling arm, his other hand pinning her throat, not enough to choke, but enough to terrify. His eyes, which had been glassy and vacant for days, were now burning with a lethal, terrifying intelligence. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. Zarelle struggled to breathe, her hands gripping his forearm. His skin was burning hot. "I'm your wife," she managed to choke out. "I don't have a wife," he hissed, leaning closer until his forehead touched hers. The scent of cedar and raw adrenaline rolled off him. "I have enemies, I have jailers, and now I have a woman who thinks she's clever enough to mess with my blood chemistry." "I saved you," she gasped, clawing at his hand. "They were drugging you, Aurelian. Look at your hands, you're standing." He flinched, his gaze dropping to his own legs, which were shaking violently. The realization seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He didn't let go, but his grip softened. He looked back at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a lie. "Why?" he demanded. "Because I need you awake," Zarelle said, her voice regaining its iron. "I can't fight a war with a husband who's a vegetable. Now let go, or I'll put the sedatives back in your water myself." Aurelian stared at her for a heartbeat longer, a dark, dangerous smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You've got fire, Zarelle Nyx. Let's see how long it takes for this house to blow out." The dining hall was an expanse of cold mahogany and sharp edges, lit by a chandelier that dripped with enough crystal to pay off Maya's debts 10 times over. At the head of the table sat Uncle Sang-hoon, a man with a smile as artificial as the peace in the room. He didn't look at Zarelle. He looked through her, as if she were a piece of furniture that had been delivered in the wrong color. Aurelian sat opposite him, back in the wheelchair, his face a mask of stone. To the casual observer, he was the same docile air, but Zarelle could see the tension in his jaw. The dragon was awake, and he was watching. "It is a pity, Aurelian," Sang-hoon said, swirling a glass of vintage wine. "The American merger is delicate. To bring in an outsider of such vivid background suggests a lack of focus. The board is concerned that your judgment is as impaired as your mobility." He finally flicked his eyes toward Zarelle, dripping with condescension. "But I suppose she is pleasant to look at. A quiet hobby to keep you occupied while I finalize the divestment of the tech sector." Zarelle felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. This wasn't a dinner, it was a hostile takeover. She set her gold-plated fork down with a deliberate asterisk clink that silenced the room. "Divestment?" Zarelle asked, her voice silky and sharp. "You mean the fire sale of the R&D department you've been leaking to the press for the last quarter?" Sang-hoon's smile faltered. "This is a family matter, girl. You wouldn't understand the nuances of." "I understand that you've been artificially deflating the stock price to make the tech sector look like a liability," Zarelle interrupted, leaning forward. She didn't look like a trophy wife. She looked like a predator. "You've moved 3 of your shell companies into position to buy the patents at 40 cents on the dollar. It's a classic squeeze-in strip. But there's a flaw in your nuance, Uncle. You forgot to account for the federal trade regulations regarding offshore tech transfers." She flashed a smile that was all teeth. "If you move forward with that sale on Monday, the audit I've already drafted, as a concerned family consultant, will trigger a freeze on your personal assets before the ink is dry. You aren't saving the company. You're cannibalizing it because you're afraid of what happens when Aurelian stands up." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the marble floor. Sang-hoon's face turned a mottled shade of purple, his hand trembling on his wine glass. He looked at Aurelian, expecting him to silence her. Instead, Aurelian leaned back, a low, dark chuckle vibrating in his chest. It was the first time Zarelle had heard him laugh, and it sent a shiver down her spine. He looked at her, his dark eyes burning with a mixture of amusement and something far more intimate. "It seems, Uncle," Aurelian said, his voice a lethal purr, "that my wife is far more than a hobby. She's a professional, and I'd listen to her if I were you. She tends to be very thorough with her disasters." Sang-hoon stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. He left without a word, his aura of power shattered. As the doors slammed shut, Aurelian turned to Zarelle. He didn't reach for her hand, but the way he looked at her was a vow. "Crisis manager," he murmured. "Remind me never to lie to you." "Don't worry," Zarelle said, picking up her wine. "I'll know if you do." The moon was a sliver of ice over the estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the master suite. Zarelle was wide awake, her senses still humming from the dinner confrontation, when the click of a deadbolt echoing through the vents stopped her breath. It wasn't the heavy thud of Chief Hand's boots. It was the whisper of silk on stone. She rolled out of bed, her bare feet silent on the heated floors. "Aurelian," she hissed, shaking his shoulder. He was awake instantly, his eyes clear and lethal. He reached for the suppressed pistol hidden beneath his pillow, but his movements were stiff, his muscles still fighting the lingering shadows of the sedatives. "Don't," Zarelle whispered, pressing her hand over his. "The shadows in the hallway, there are 2 of them. If you fire, Hand's men will crossfire and finish the job. We don't know who's on which side." "I'm not dying in this bed," Aurelian rasped, trying to brace himself. "You aren't dying at all." Zarelle's mind raced through the room's layout. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the environment. She grabbed a heavy glass carafe from the nightstand and poured the water over the high-gloss marble entrance of the suite. Then, she snatched a bottle of expensive, oil-based bath serum from the vanity and smashed it into the puddle, creating a slick, invisible death trap. She pulled Aurelian's wheelchair into the center of the room, positioning it behind the heavy mahogany desk, then ducked into the darkness beside him. The door creaked open. A shadow slipped inside, a suppressed blade glinting in the dim light. The intruder moved with professional speed until his lead foot hit the oil-slicked marble. He went down with a sickening asterisk crack, his skull meeting the floor with enough force to daze a bull. Before the second man could react, Zarelle reached for the smart home panel behind the desk. She didn't hit the alarm. She hit the fire suppression override for the east wing. A deafening hiss filled the room as a cloud of freezing CO2 gas erupted from the ceiling, blinding the second attacker. In the confusion, Zarelle threw the heavy metal carafe with the precision of a woman who had survived the Bronx. It clipped the man's temple, sending him reeling into the doorframe. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Aurelian sat in the dark, his chest heaving, his hand still gripped around the pistol he hadn't needed to fire. He looked at the 2 unconscious men, then up at Zarelle, who was standing in her silk nightgown, breathing hard, her hair slightly mussed. "You didn't use a gun," he murmured, his voice laced with a new kind of awe. "Guns are loud," Zarelle said, her adrenaline beginning to crash. "Logic is quieter." Aurelian reached out, lacing his fingers through hers. For the first time, he didn't pull her toward him to dominate or demand. He just held her hand. "I spent 2 years thinking I was the only thing left worth protecting in this house," he whispered. "I was wrong." In the pale moonlight, the trillionaire and the crisis manager sat in the wreckage of an assassination attempt, the line between contract and reality finally beginning to blur. The scent of salt and expensive teakwood hung heavy in the air as the obsidian cut through the dark waters of the Incheon coast. The yacht was a floating fortress, the ultimate safe house, but to Zarelle, it felt like another box. Aurelian stood by the railing, his back to her. He wasn't using the chair. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. "There's a plane waiting at a private strip in 3 hours," he said, his voice as cold as the sea spray. "It'll take you to Switzerland. New identity, a trust fund that will keep you and Maya safe for a lifetime. The contract is void, Zarelle. You're free." Zarelle didn't move. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but her gaze remained fixed on him. "You're firing me after I saved your life." "I'm saving yours." Aurelian spun around, his composure finally cracking. The raw fear in his eyes was more terrifying than any assassin. "Han's men are compromised. My family is a nest of vipers. Last night was a warning. Next time they won't slip on the floor. They'll burn the whole house down just to get to me. I won't have your blood on my hands." "You think I'm just a civilian caught in the crossfire?" Zarelle stepped into his space, her chest heaving. "I'm a crisis manager, Aurelian. I don't run from the fire. I find the person holding the matches. And I found them." Aurelian still. "What are you talking about?" "It's not just your uncle. It's the director. The one person who has access to your medical encryption and the estate's thermal sensors. It's your chief of security, Han. He's not guarding you. He's a sleeper agent for the board." She pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. "I mirrored his phone when I tripped near him this morning. He's taking orders from your sister, Minjai." Aurelian stared at the driver, then at her. The silence between them stretched, thick with the realization that she had stayed to fight a war she didn't owe him. "You stayed," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. "Why?" "Because you're my disaster now," Zarelle breathed, her hand reaching out to touch his jaw. "And I don't leave until the job is done." The wall he had built around himself for years didn't just crumble, it vanished. Aurelian dropped the cane, the clatter on the deck echoing the snap of the tension between them. He pulled her into him, his kiss desperate and hungry, a collision of two lonely souls finally finding an ally in the dark. He lifted her easily, carrying her into the master cabin where the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the engine and their tangled breathing. In the heat of the night, the contract became a distant memory. There were no more lies, no more debts, only the fierce, undeniable reality of a queen who had chosen her king, and a king who would now burn the world to keep her. The Grand Hyatt Seoul was a fortress of glass, gold leaf, and high society pretense. This was the Red Gala, the annual centerpiece of the Park Cross Empire, and tonight it was a killing floor. Zarelle stepped out of the black limousine, and the wall of camera flashes was blinding. She wore the gown she designed for this exact moment, ivory silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, off-the-shoulder sleeves that showcased her poise, and a train that swept the floor with regal defiance. Beside her, Aurelian sat in his matte black wheelchair, looking every bit the silent king, but his hand was firmly clasped over hers. "Remember," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the roar of the press. "We aren't here to celebrate, we're the bait." "I've spent my life managing other people's PR nightmares, Aurelian," Zarelle whispered back, flashing a radiant, predatory smile for the cameras. "I think I can handle being the center of one." As they entered the ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Zarelle's eyes scanned the room with professional precision. She saw the director, Aurelian's sister, Minjai, standing near the champagne fountain, looking radiant and lethal in crimson. She saw Chief Han stationed by the north exit, his hand hovering near his jacket. They were surrounded. The music was a sweeping orchestral piece that felt more like a funeral march. Aurelian led her to the center of the floor. For a few minutes, they played the part of the perfect, high-power couple. But as the clock struck midnight, the music didn't just stop. It distorted into a screeching electronic wail. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom slammed shut with a series of metallic clicks, magnetic deadbolts. "The building is in lockdown," Zarelle noted, her voice steady even as the guests began to panic. "Signals are jammed. No cell service, no Wi-Fi." Minjai stepped forward, a remote detonator-style device in her hand, her face twisted into a mask of triumph. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Aurelian. And you," she spat, looking at Zarelle, "should have stayed in Chicago. This isn't a merger anymore. It's an inheritance." The lights flickered and died, plunged the room into a terrifying, high-contrast red emergency glow. From the shadows of the mezzanine, armed men in tactical gear emerged, their laser sights dancing across the panicked crowd like fireflies. Zarelle didn't scream. She stepped in front of Aurelian's chair, her white gown glowing blood red in the emergency lights. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her bodice, the evidence that could end this. But as the first shot rang out, shattering a crystal chandelier above them, she realized that logic wouldn't save them tonight. "The trap is sprung," Aurelian rasped, reaching for the hidden release on his chair. But they forgot one thing. "What's that?" Zarelle asked, her eyes locked on Chief Han as he drew his weapon. "They trapped me in here with you." Panic screamed through the ballroom as the tactical team descended, but Zarelle was already moving. She didn't head for the exits. She headed for the fuse box she'd memorized on the floor plan. "Get him!" Minjai shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the center of the floor. Chief Han moved like a shadow, lunging forward to kick Aurelian's wheelchair over. The chair skidded across the marble, and Aurelian hit the floor with a heavy thud. The crowd gasped, a collective mourning for the fallen king. Han stood over him, aiming his weapon at Aurelian's head. "Pathetic to the end," Han sneered. "Now Zarelle," Aurelian roared. Zarelle slammed the fire axe into the localized power relay. The red emergency lights died, plunging the room into absolute, suffocating darkness. The sound of a struggle erupted, the wet thud of bone hitting meat, the gasp of a man losing his breath. When a secondary backup light flickered on 5 seconds later, the room froze. Aurelian Cross was standing. He wasn't just standing. He had Chief Han in a lethal chokehold, his suit jacket straining against shoulders that were no longer frail. The wheelchair lay forgotten 10 feet away. Aurelian's legs, though trembling with the effort of months of secret, agonizing physical therapy, held his weight. With a guttural snarl, he snapped Han's wrist, sending the gun clattering away, and leveled the man with a clinical strike to the temple. "The chair was a lie," Minjai gasped, backing away into the arms of her own confused mercenaries. "The chair was a vantage point," Aurelian rasped, his eyes burning. "It's amazing what people say when they think you're too broken to move." Zarelle didn't waste the moment. She grabbed a heavy decorative spear from a nearby display of traditional armor and jammed it through the handles of the main exit, barricading the mercenaries' reinforcements out. She then triggered the building's industrial kitchen vents, sending a localized blast of CO2 into the mezzanine, blinding the snipers. "North Service elevator," Zarelle shouted, grabbing Aurelian's arm. "I've overridden the lock from my tablet. It's the only line still moving." They ran. Aurelian stumbled, his strength flagging, and Zarelle caught his weight, her white gown now stained with grease and the copper tang of blood. They burst through the service doors just as the mercenaries opened fire, the bullets sparking off the steel elevator doors as they hissed shut. In the silence of the rising lift, Aurelian leaned against the mirrored wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at his shaking hands, then at Zarelle. "They saw," he whispered. "The board, the press, the world. I can't go back to the shadows, Zarelle." "Good," Zarelle said, tearing a strip of her silk train to bind a graze on his arm. She looked at his reflection, a man standing on his own 2 feet. "The shadows were too small for you anyway." The secret was out. The Silent King had stood up, and by the time the elevator hit the roof where the Obsidians, the extraction team, waited, the war for the Cross Empire had moved from a cold simmer to a total, public blaze. The skyline of Brooklyn was a jagged silhouette against the orange glow of sunset, a far cry from the sterile marble of Seoul. Zarelle stood on the balcony of her new office, the logo for Nyx Crisis Global etched into the glass. It had been 6 months since the Red Gala, 6 months since she'd left Korea to rebuild her life on her own terms. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of a footstep behind her. It wasn't the hum of a wheelchair. Zarelle turned. Aurelian stood in the doorway, leaning lightly on a silver-headed cane. He looked different. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, peaceful clarity. "The board met this morning," Aurelian said, his voice carrying across the humid New York air. "Minjai has been stripped of her shares. She's facing 20 years for the assassination attempts and corporate espionage. The director is gone, Zarelle. The empire is clean." Zarelle crossed her arms, her heart thudding. "And why are you telling me this in person? You have lawyers for press releases." Aurelian walked toward her, each step deliberate. He stopped inches away and reached into his coat, pulling out a small, worn velvet box. "I realized that our first contract was missing a crucial clause," he said softly. He didn't drop to a knee. His legs wouldn't allow it, but he bowed his head with a reverence she'd never seen. "I don't want a fixer, Zarelle, and I don't want a shield. I want a partner who looks at the world like she's already conquered it." He opened the box to reveal a ring set with a raw, uncut black diamond. "No debts, no syndicate, no forced vows. Just me asking you to come back to Seoul because the throne is too cold without you." Zarelle looked at the ring, then at the man who had fought his way out of a gilded cage just to stand beside her. "You're a very expensive disaster, Aurelian Cross," she whispered, a smile finally breaking through. "But I think I'm the only one who can manage you." 5 years later. The rooftop of the Cross estate in Seoul was no longer a place of shadows. It was a garden of blooming jasmine and laughter. The city glittered below, but Aurelian's gaze was fixed on the small, dark-haired girl running circles around his legs. "Careful, Maya," Aurelian laughed, catching his daughter before she could take a tumble. He stood firm, his cane leaning against a nearby table, a tool he used less and less every day. Zarelle stepped out onto the terrace, carrying 2 glasses of wine. She watched them, the trillionaire who was no longer silent and the daughter who had her mother's defiant eyes. The forced marriage that had started in a freezing hangar had evolved into an unbreakable dynasty. Aurelian pulled Zarelle into his side, kissing her temple as the Han River reflected the moonlight. "Still shocked by the ending," he teased. Zarelle leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the city they now ruled together. "No," she said, looking at their daughter. "I think this is exactly the outcome I planned for."